we're thinking about Psalm 40. We're thinking about this pit that David describes. And if you were there on Wednesday, you'll remember that we've been thinking about how it matters so much whenever we're in the pit what we do with our eyes, which way we look. If we're in the pit and all we do is we look down here, we look at the mud, we look at the clay, we look at the slime, we look at the grime, we're going to be crushed. But David showed us that there are better places to look. And on Wednesday, we thought about how David looks back. And at the end of the psalm, verses we didn't read this morning, but verse 13 to verse 17, we see that David is facing a trial. And at the start of the psalm, verse 1 to verse 5, we see that David is reflecting on a previous trial, a previous time that he was in the pit. And so there's a lesson in that for us. The lesson is, it can be helpful to look back. Now, it's not good, of course, to just dwell in the past. That's generally not a useful thing. But it can be helpful to look back on difficult times, to look back and to remember how God has been faithful to us, how God has been good to us. And then as we look back, we take what we learned in the past, we apply it to the present, and we then have great confidence as we face the struggles we have to face now. So looking back, as long as we're looking back on God's faithfulness, can be a useful thing. But today we're going to change direction, and instead of looking back, we're going to look up. So let's look up along with David. Because even though it is dark, and even though it's dreary, and even though David feels as though he is completely alone, David knows that there is a God he can depend on. And he remembers that from the past. So in verse 1, he waits for the Lord. He pleads with God. He begs God to send him support and to send him deliverance. And so what I want us to do this morning is I want us to see what happens next. What happens whenever David looks up? What happens whenever he waits for God? And the first thing we see is this. God answers. God answers. See that in verse 1. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. I remember reading a story in the paper, read it about 9 or 10 years ago. It's a long time ago, but I don't think I'm ever going to forget this story. This guy had been interviewed, and he'd been at a party. It was an all-night party at someone's house in London, and they'd been doing what people do at parties, and this wasn't the best idea in the world, but they decided it was getting very late or very early, depending on what way you want to look at it. They decided to get up onto the roof of this guy's house, because they thought, let's watch the sunrise, that'll be lovely, we'll watch the sunrise. So everybody gets up onto the roof, and there they are, all perched on the crest of the roof. But there's a problem. The problem is there's just not enough room for everybody who's up there. So this one guy, he has the bright idea, well, you know what, there's a little bit of space just at the chimney. So he sits on the rim of the chimney. I don't know what possessed him, but he dangles his legs down the inside of the chimney. So he's sitting there, merrily watching the sunrise with everybody else, and you can guess what happens next. He slips, and he falls in. And because there's so many people there, and so much going on, nobody actually noticed that he was gone. And in the interview, he says, I was shouting and shouting and shouting for 2 whole hours, and nobody heard me. And eventually, everybody left. Everybody went home. They sort of noticed he wasn't there. They just assumed that he must have gone hours ago. This poor guy, shouting and shouting at the top of his lungs, nobody can hear. If you want to know how it ends, eventually the fire brigade got him out, and he spent 7 hours in the chimney. So, boys and girls, don't sit in the rim of a chimney. It's not a good idea. But I imagine for some of you, that's the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? I'm glad Ruth isn't here this morning. She wouldn't like that one bit. Imagine being trapped somewhere with a tight confined space and you're screaming at the top of your lungs and you're so wedged that you're not able to move, and no matter how loud you scream, nobody's able to hear you. Well, you can well imagine that would maybe happen in one of these pits. You imagine being so far down that you scream and you scream and you scream until you've got no breath left and nobody hears. It's a horrible experience. But it's not David's experience. Because as David cries out, someone does hear, and there's an immediate response. God hears, verse 1, and not only does God hear, but God turns to David. We could say God gives David his complete, undivided attention. He turned to me and he heard my cry. It's not a wonderful thing. Is it not amazing that the God who you would think should be so busy running the whole universe has enough time, has enough interest to hear our voice and turn towards us? Is that not so comforting? Whenever we are in the depths, whenever we're in the pit, whenever we're completely broken, whenever we're hurt, whenever we're at the end of our tether, there's someone who hears us. But especially, isn't that such a comfort whenever we think of our sin and our shame? Because if there is one pit that is deeper than any other, it is surely the pit that each of us digs for ourselves. The pit of sin, the pit of guilt, the pit that no matter how hard we try, we can never climb out of. The pit that causes us to sink down. We sink down into the mud, don't we? The mud of our idolatry. We get pulled down by the clinging clay of our pride. We get sucked in by the grime of our stubbornness and our self-centeredness. And we're crushed by the sheer weight, the sheer burden of our guilt and our shame. And you would think, given that we've dug this pit for ourselves, you would think that God would want nothing to do with us whatsoever. You would think that God would say to us, well, you've made your bed, you're going to have to lie in it. And yet he doesn't. Whenever we call out, whenever we confess our sin, whenever we cry out for mercy, he turns to us and he hears our cry. So that's the first thing that happens whenever we look up. God answers. Second thing, God delivers. God delivers. I realise we thought about this a bit on Wednesday night, but it is one of the really big themes of the psalm. Verse 2, he lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. And as it's communion today, I want us to think especially about that pit of sin and guilt. I want us to think of how God has seen us. He's seen us, he's heard us in our sin and our misery. He's seen how we're completely bogged down, how we're at the bottom of the pit, how we're completely hopeless, and he's done something about it. I don't imagine that anybody here is going to be familiar with the name Manuel Gonzalez. But I think you probably actually, maybe not the young people, but the older ones, you've all seen him on TV. Do you remember, more than 10 years ago now, do you remember the miners in Chile? And they were trapped for weeks, it was 60-something days, wasn't it? And you might remember that eventually the rescuers, they dug this sort of rescue shaft. It was just big enough for a capsule holding a person to go down, and that was what was going to bring the miners up. But you might remember, before any of the miners could come up, someone had to go down. And Manuel Gonzalez was the man. He was the first rescuer to go down into the pit. He was the first human being that these men had seen for months. And he also, by the way, was the very last person to go back up. He stayed down there for the duration of the rescue. Well, it's communion today, and at communion, it's really good to marvel at the fact that we have a rescuer and he's gone down to the pit. We marvel at the fact that God didn't simply rescue us by sending down a big long rope and winching us up. But we marvel because Jesus Christ has actually gone down into the hole and he's joined us. He spent 30 years living in a broken world. He spent his days living with sinful men and sinful women like us. And then, whenever the time came for Jesus to go to the cross, even though he had never sinned even once, the awful, mucky, vile, wretched, clinging guilt of ours was placed on Jesus. And as Jesus went to the cross, he went down deeper than anybody has ever done before. He endured a darkness that is thicker and heavier than anything any of us can ever imagine. Why did he do it? He did it so that you can get out. So that I can get out. It's an incredible thing to remember. Of course, it also places a pretty big responsibility on our shoulders. You imagine those men in the mine in Chile. You imagine Manuel Gonzalez stepping out of the capsule. Imagine one of the men says, "You know what? I think I'm going to stay here. I think I could probably find another way out. If I just put my mind to it, there's bound to be another way. Don't like the idea of this narrow shaft going up to the surface. I'll just find my own way out." Can you imagine that? Or imagine someone says to him, "Well, you know what? I really appreciate you coming down to get us, but we've been having a great time down here. And maybe if you went back up, if you came down in 2 or 3 weeks' time, we just want to finish off a few things, you come back later and we'll happily take a rescue then, but for now, we're okay." I mean, obviously it's not going to happen. But imagine it did. Imagine what a slap in the face it would be to this man who has risked his own life to be able to bring these guys back to safety. And yet people do that all the time. They do it to Jesus all the time. Jesus has given his very life to bring sinners out of the pit. And yet how often do people decide they're going to stay? That's a slap in the face, isn't it? A slap in the face to the Lord Jesus to decide that actually you can get your own way out. It's a despicable insult to the Son of God himself to say, "I'm interested in being rescued, but not just yet. I've got some living to do first." And maybe some of you this morning are in that position. And maybe some of you this morning, you need to think really carefully, not just about what Jesus has offered to do for us, but about what Jesus has already done to make that possible. And maybe you need to think about your response and what that says to Jesus. For those of you, though, who have taken that rescue, well, here's an opportunity to marvel this morning. Because we've got a visual reminder. We've got a children's address, if you like, but it's for the adults too. A reminder of what Jesus has done for us. A reminder of Jesus going down into the pit. A reminder of Jesus' body being broken for us and Jesus' blood being poured out. And so this morning, whether you are eating and drinking, or whether you're watching, take the time to marvel and to be amazed. And as we prepare for the Lord's Supper, I want to speak especially to anybody here who is a Christian, but who's struggling with doubts. And maybe you're very, very conscious of your weakness and your sinfulness and the mistakes that you've made in your life. And maybe you're so conscious of your mistakes and your sin that you doubt whether God could ever truly love you. And you doubt whether you truly actually belong amongst God's people. Maybe you have this fear that's never far away, that the day might come when God just decides he's going to wash his hands. He's going to be done with you, and that's going to be that. Well, communion, the Lord's Supper, is a really good opportunity to re-find our bearings. It's a chance to stop what we're doing, which very often is finding our sense of assurance in our performance and what we do. It's a chance to stop doing that, to stop sinking in the mud, and instead to remind ourselves that our safety and our deliverance comes from this. Not from us, but from this. And so, whether you're eating or drinking today, whether you're watching, whatever you're doing, allow your soul to stand on the solid ground, not of what we do, but of what the Lord Jesus has done. And number 40, we've been thinking about what happens whenever David looks up. We've seen two things so far. We've seen that God answers him. We've seen that God delivers him. The third thing that we see is that God fills David with joy. So God fills David with joy. You see that in verse 2. Verse 3 rather. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. You think back again to those men who were trapped in Chile. Can you imagine if maybe some of those men, they stepped out of that hole and they just sort of shrugged their shoulders? And can you imagine if maybe a while later they were, I don't know, on a talk show or something like that, and they're describing their ordeal, and they're maybe describing the moment that they stepped out of the capsule and they put their feet on the solid ground at the surface, and imagine that their tone of voice was the same tone of voice that you would describe which brand of tea bags you buy from the supermarket. It wouldn't happen. It would be wrong. It would be just something completely twisted if that was to be the case. But how much more should we be moved by the rescue that we've received? We've been saved from hopelessness and desperation. We have been rescued from an eternity of deserved judgment. And so surely our hearts should be bursting. Surely we should be moved deep inside our souls. And surely that moving that's deep inside us, it should bubble up, shouldn't it? It should come all the way to the surface. And I think that's all the more true when we realise we are not the only ones who are rejoicing. Do you remember Jesus' parable of the lost sheep? It's in Luke chapter 15. You can look it up later on. But do you remember what the shepherd does after he finds the sheep? He rejoices. And not only that, but the shepherd calls his friends and he calls his neighbours and he says, I want you to come to my house. We're going to celebrate. We're going to rejoice because I have found my lost sheep. And then Jesus goes on to explain to us that when a sinner repents, when someone like you or someone like me is lifted from the pit and is placed on solid ground, there is rejoicing in heaven. And some of you, you'll maybe remember seeing the live footage of those miners in Chile being lifted out. And the thing that really stands out for me was the sheer joy of the whole thing. There was the joy of the miners as they finally stepped out. There was the joy of the people on the surface as they saw man after man being delivered. And there was singing, there was cheering, there were fist pumps. It was incredible. It was a joyous party. It was wonderful. But it's nothing compared to the joy of our salvation. It's nothing compared to the joy of being lifted from the pit of sin. And it's nothing compared to the joy that many of us have had of hearing of friends or neighbours or family members or loved ones who have also been brought out and who are joining us on solid ground. It's certainly nothing compared to the joy of the angels, who were told long to look into these things. And so you can imagine the angels, and it's almost like they're craning their necks, and they're trying to see what Christ has accomplished, and they're trying to see sinner after sinner being brought out of the pit. And of course, most of all, the joy in Chile was nothing compared to the joy of Jesus himself. The great hero, the great rescuer, the one who rejoices when he finds his lost sheep. And so in one sense, we're like men and women being lifted from the pit. In one sense, this morning, we're leaving our survival rations behind and we're feasting at a table. Surely, as we do that, surely as we tuck in this morning, we should be joyful. And if that's a foreign thing to you, if you still haven't experienced this rescue yourself, if I'm speaking about joy and you just can't understand it because you haven't been through it, well, I want you to remember this morning how awful it is, how terrible it is to be trapped down below. But more than that, look at David's joy. And remember, this is what God invites you to as you come to his Son Jesus. And Jesus says to you, he gives you an invitation. Come and enter my joy. So if you're still in the pit this morning, you haven't yet experienced this joy. Well, why not do that? Why not take Jesus up on his invitation? Why not look up just like David? And why not do it?